Thank you all for joining. My name is Omar Shakir from Human Rights Watch. This week marks 50 years of Israel's occupation of the West Bank, Golan Heights, and Gaza Strip, making it, according to the International Committee for the Red Cross, the world's longest sustained military occupation in modern history. Reflecting this week on the magnitude of 5 decades of Israeli occupation, the UN Coordinator for Humanitarian Aid and Development Aid, Robert Piper, declared that the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories is the most long-standing protection crisis in the UN's history. Here in the United States, this occasion has passed with hardly any mention, despite recent warnings by public officials and others about the urgency of the situation on the ground. Just in October, the State Department warned that Israel's decision at the time to build new settlement units marked, and I quote, "another step towards cementing a one-state reality of perpetual occupation that is inconsistent with Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state." In his final press conference, former President Barack Obama echoed a similar message, and I quote, "I don't see how this issue gets resolved in a way that maintains Israel as both Jewish and a democracy. Because if you do not have two states, then in some form or fashion you are extending an occupation. Functionally, you end up having one state in which millions of people are disenfranchised and operate as second-class residents. You can't call them citizens necessarily." Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here today to tell you that the scenario that the State Department and President Obama spoke of is not some hypothetical future scenario, but rather a description of the current reality on the ground that has been the case for much of the life of Israel's occupation. As part of our work as Human Rights Watch, documenting human rights abuses and advocating for human rights protections in over 90 countries across the world, we have been documenting abuse in Israel and Palestine for nearly 3 decades. And for much of this time in the Israeli-Palestinian context, we found ourselves documenting the same sorts of abuses. In particular, Israel has sustained its occupation through repression and systematic abuses of the Palestinian population's rights. It today maintains its occupation through an entrenched system of institutional discrimination against Palestinians in the occupied territory. Many of these abusive practices, of course, as many of you are aware, have been justified in the name of security. Indeed, Palestinian armed groups have carried out scores of lethal attacks on civilians and launched thousands of rockets on Israeli civilian areas in violation of international humanitarian law. The Israeli human rights group B'Tselem estimates that between 1987 and the end of February 2017, 1,087 Israeli civilians have been killed in these attacks. However, Israel's repression extends far beyond any security rationale. At least 5 major categories of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law characterize this occupation, each of which has profound implications for Palestinian children. And I'll go through each of those categories in brief. The first, unlawful killings and war crimes without accountability. In the last Gaza war alone, in July and August of 2014, Israeli forces killed at least 2,100 Palestinians. The UN identified over 1,500 of those as civilians, and over 500 as children. Many of these attacks, according to investigations carried out by Human Rights Watch, constituted violations of international humanitarian law, and some even war crimes, including the apparent targeting of civilian structures. In addition, Israeli security forces routinely use excessive force in policing situations, and they have killed, in the span of the occupation, thousands of Palestinians, whether they be demonstrators, rock throwers, passers-by, suspected assailants, or others, with live ammunition when lesser means could have maintained order. Human Rights Watch, in the last year, interviewed a family from the refugee camp of Qalandia in the occupied West Bank that has lost 3 of their sons, each to excessive force used by Israel. In 2001, 11-year-old Yasser was shot while throwing stones. The Israeli Defense Forces carried out an investigation and found that forces had adhered to firing guidelines. 40 days later, their other son, 15-year-old Samer, was killed, also on the claim that he was throwing rocks. No one was held to account. 14 years later, their 17-year-old son, Muhammad, was shot from a distance of 10 meters away as he ran away from an Israeli jeep after, according to witnesses interviewed by the Israeli Human Rights Committee, is not a matter of a few isolated cases, but rather is a systematic policy. The failure to hold perpetrators of serious crimes to account, whether it be on the Israeli or the Palestinian side, has unfortunately been a characteristic of 5 decades of occupation. In fact, B'Tselem has described Israeli investigations as, quote, a whitewash operation. The second category of abuse that Human Rights Watch has found characteristic or endemic of this occupation is illegal settlements and the accompanying discriminatory system. Israeli authorities have facilitated the transfer of their own civilians to the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which is a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention and a war crime. Today, there are over 580,000 settlers living in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, alongside well over 2 million Palestinians. Israel applies Israel's civil law to those Jewish Israeli settlers, affording them legal protections, rights, and benefits not extended to Palestinians living in the very same territory, who are subject to Israeli military law. Israel also provides settlers with infrastructure, services, and subsidies that it denies to Palestinians, creating a separate and unequal system of laws, rules, and services. And that's not just a term that Human Rights Watch used. Outgoing Secretary of State John Kerry used the very same term to describe treatment of Palestinians in the occupied territories. So imagine this reality today. You can have a Palestinian kid and an Israeli kid who live 2 kilometers apart. If the Israeli kid commits a crime, he is tried in an Israeli civil court under Israeli civil law. If a Palestinian child 2 kilometers away commits a crime, he is tried in military court subject to military law. People living in the very same territory. And that discrimination, that institutional discrimination that has become endemic, extends to virtually every aspect of life in the occupied West Bank, including things like access to water and freedom of movement. The third abuse that we've documented is forced displacement. Now, this takes several forms. First, and most directly, is the expropriation of thousands of acres of Palestinian land, the theft of Palestinian land, for settlements and the supporting infrastructure. It also extends, though, to Israel's policy of arbitrarily excluding thousands of Palestinians from the population registry, which restricts their ability to live and travel in the West Bank and Gaza. Israel has also revoked the residency of over 130,000 Palestinians in the West Bank and nearly 15,000 in Jerusalem alone. Israel also imposes discriminatory burdens on Palestinians when it comes to permitting. So in nearly 60% of the West Bank, Area C that's under exclusive Israeli control, it is nearly impossible for a Palestinian to obtain a permit to build a home. And it's the same situation in East Jerusalem, which effectively forces families to make a decision. Either you leave your homes or you build a home without a permit and risk home demolition. And indeed, Israel has carried out thousands of home demolitions on the basis of lacking a permit. Just last month, Human Rights Watch documented the case of Ashraf and Islam Fawaka from East Jerusalem, who were at the checkup for their 1-month-old daughter when they got a call that their home had been demolished for lacking a permit. Today, their now 2-month-old daughter Aya, their 4-year-old Saba, their 7-year-old Remus, and their 9-year-old Ritaj are residing in a tent alongside the ruins of their former home. The fourth category of abuse Human Rights Watch has documented is the Gaza closure and unjustified movement restrictions in the West Bank. In the West Bank, those restrictions take the form of checkpoints and the separation barrier, 85% of which is not built on the green line that separates Israel and the West Bank, but rather cuts and slices deep into the West Bank, which the International Court of Justice found to be a violation of international humanitarian law. In Gaza, for the last 25 years, Israel has tightened restrictions on the movement of people and goods. Although Israel withdrew in 2005, it maintains control of the airspace, the water space, the border, the entry of people and goods. It effectively runs Gaza as an open-air prison today. Next week marks 10 years of Israel's closure of Gaza, in which it effectively has had a travel ban on the entry or exit of any Palestinians from Gaza, subject to a set of exemptions. And even with exemptions, such as for urgent medical situations, it's been very difficult in practice for Palestinians to leave. In fact, the World Health Organization in December of 2016 found that only 41.7% of Palestinians that applied for a permit with an urgent medical situation were able to obtain one. Just in January, a 17-year-old, Ahmed Shubair, died of heart failure, having a congenital heart condition. He had been denied a permit to go to Israel for medical treatment just several months before. As you can imagine, the Gaza closure affects every aspect of life. Gaza's GDP today is 23% lower than it was in 1994, and 70% of Palestinians in Gaza rely on humanitarian aid to survive. And the final category of abuse that Human Rights Watch has documented over the course of the life of the occupation is abusive detention. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been detained, the majority in military courts that have a near 100% conviction rate. Hundreds annually have been held on average in administrative detention based on secret evidence without charge or trial. Some have been held for doing no more than engaging in nonviolent activism. Israel detains Palestinian detainees from the West Bank and Gaza within Israel, which is a violation of international humanitarian law, and imposes onerous restrictions on family visits. And children have been detained as young as 11 years old. And many of those detained, as we've documented, and you'll hear more of shortly, have been subjected to force in detention, including choking, use of stun grenades, and threats and interrogations without the presence of parents and lawyer. Criminal lawyers tell us this governs the occupation is based on the idea of occupation being temporary and exceptional. What we have today is an effectively permanent, prolonged occupation with no end in sight. This is a situation that has few precedents in history. But what we do know is as time goes on, the rights, obligations, and duties upon Israel as an occupying power only increase. My final point I want to make is that after 50 years of occupation and decades of a fruitless peace process, it should be clear to everybody that downplaying rights will not ease the path to a solution. There's a need for us to take action on human rights and to have accountability, without which peace is simply not possible. In this country, we've held the two-state solution as a holy grail, but not because the situation on the ground, not because settlements are war crime, not because settlements are established on land unlawfully seized from Palestinians, not because settlements wreak havoc on the everyday life of Palestinians, not because of the system of institutional discrimination on the ground, but simply around the idea of separation. Any discussion of solution needs to be grounded in the reality of 50 years of occupation, repression, systematic abuse, and institutional discrimination. We need action. Let us not be here in 50 years bemoaning another 50 years of ugly, abusive occupation. Thank you.